Hello, everyone, and welcome to I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist, the podcast that shows fundamentalism can start out fun, but certainly ends up mental. I am Troy, one of the hosts, and of course, sitting next to me in the virtual video recording space is my colleague, Brian McDowell. How you going, Brian?
Good, mate. As those on video can see, I am all merched up. I am trying
Yeah,
to
that's
promote
two.
the
That's
pod.
two podcasts in a row. Anyone would think that was actually some sort of intent to sell.
Never, never. But you could visit our Redbubble page if you do want to get merch. So,
If you
you know,
did want to, yes,
yeah.
because we're not trying to sell. I'm all Van Halen up, actually. I got this at a $10 like counter section at Kmart. I'm quite happy with my Van Halen shirt.
Well, I was a teenage fundamentalist. Aren't that cheap? We're more, but we get a massive cut of about $1.25 per t-shirt. So it's enormous, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. So it's more about you, the people that buy the t-shirt, than it is about us. Hey, but Brian, enough of this banter because we get pissed off listening to other people's podcasts when they banter too long. Why don't you tell us all about who today's guest is and let's jump right in?
Sounds good. And those, again, on video, you would have been able to see we've got a guest. So I'm going
Oh
to
no,
tell
no,
you
no,
about
we
them.
edit now. We edit now, so it's all cut out. Yeah, it's
Ah,
not like the
okay.
old days. Yeah.
Ah,
Yeah,
there
they
you
they
go.
haven't seen her yet. They haven't seen her yet.
Okay, well, so this is the reveal. That's
Yeah,
the reveal.
this
All
is it.
right, beautiful. I love it. So today we've got Claire Hoffman. Claire's an American journalist and author renowned for her in-depth explorations of religion, culture, and fame. Born and raised in Iowa within the Transcendental meditation movement. I'm looking forward to hearing a bit more about this. An experience she detailed in her 2016 memoir, Greetings from Utopia Park, Surviving a Transcendent Childhood. Claire holds a master's degree in religious studies from the University of Chicago Divinity School and another in journalism from Columbia University. And we're just chatting before the show, and there's another master's. So maybe you can reveal that in a minute, Claire. But Claire's journalism career includes contributions to prominent publications such as The New Yorker, Rolling Stone, and the LA Times, where she gained attention for her investigative journaling or reporting. Um, Currently, she serves assistant professor of journalism at the University of California, Riverside. That could be incorrect because I'm seeing head shakes. See, this is what happens when we do research. So you can correct that again in a minute, Claire. But we've got Claire on to talk about her latest work, Sister Sinner, The Miraculous Life and Mysterious Disappearance of Aimee Semple McPherson. And that's pretty fresh out. So it's the last month or two that's come out. And what that book does, it delves into the life of the 1920s evangelical evangelist who pioneered modern religious broadcasting and founded the International Church of the Foursquare Gospel, which many of our listeners will be very familiar with. Aimee is an interesting character, and we're going to dive into it and talk about many of the different things in her life, particularly her disappearance in 1926 and the impact that she's still had today, nearly 100 years on. So, Claire Hoffman, welcome to I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited for this conversation.
All right, Claire, this is a bit where we do a correction. So it said you were an assistant professor of journalism at the University of California. Is that made up?
It's not made up, but I did it for 4 years and then I quit. So it hasn't been true for about 10 years.
Wow, that's interesting. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. I guess
Well,
I should try and fix it. It's on Wikipedia. Is that right?
I don't know. We
Yeah.
just pulled it from quite a few
Okay.
different sources. But if Wiki's
Okay.
wrong, go in, correct it, I reckon.
Yeah. I got to get in there.
Sounds good. Hey, we are going to kick off first with the question we like to ask all of our guests. Were you a teenage fundamentalist?
Yeah. I thought about this question. I would say the answer is no. I was maybe a teenage nihilist. I sort of had grown up in a belief community, but had a real moment of doubt when I was 12 years old. So by the time I was a teenager, I was full cynic, full nihilist, I would say. I'm not still those things, but I think by the time I was a teenager, I was kind of angry and on the sort of backside of faith. Yeah.
I'm really interested to hear a little bit about that community you grew up in. I haven't read your biography, and when we're doing research for the bio, because this is something that was really interesting. When we were in the fundamentalist movement, transcendental meditation, that was just Satan. Like, it was absolutely evil. Tell us about your upbringing in this place and the impact of it. And then you were saying at 12 years old, it all turned around. Can you talk to us a bit about that?
Yeah, for sure. And I remember learning about born again Christianity in college and learning that they thought TM was satanic, and I just thought it was so funny. It's sort of giving it so much more power than it has. Um, but yeah, my parents were followers of Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, who was like the guru to the Beatles in the late 60s. They met at a transcendental meditation retreat in California and fell in love. And after they got divorced, when I was 5 years old, we were living in New York City, and my mom moved my brother and I to this little town in Iowa, Fairfield, Iowa, just, tiny little town that Maharishi had bought a abandoned, bankrupt university and told all his followers from all over the world to move there to practice group meditation together. And there were a lot of like big ideas about what group meditation could do in terms of like creating world peace and something connected to quantum mechanics. I don't know. Anyway, but that was us in the 1980s. So I went to the Maharishi School of the Age of Enlightenment, and we took a lot of classes called the Science of Creative Intelligence, which were Maharishi's kind of teachings and philosophy of life. So in a lot of ways, and I found this after I did that first book, I have a lot of overlap with people who grew up, Mormon or in born again Christian households, Jehovah's Witnesses, Catholics. They all kind of reached out to me after I wrote that book saying like there was this funny mirror, right? Like our version of it was kind of hippie and Hindu a little bit, but it was still like a very rigid belief community at that time. So, what we ate, what time we woke up, what we wore, the colors that we wore, like all of these things were prescribed according to our guru. So yeah, and by the time I was 12, I was sort of like falling apart in terms of my belief. And by the time I was a teenager, I was like drinking and doing drugs and really angry. And I've definitely like softened since then, not just in terms of drinking and doing drugs, but also my nihilism and cynicism. And I actually still meditate. I meditate once a day for 20 minutes, just like the basic meditation I learned when I was 10 years old. So I wouldn't say I've come around because I don't believe anything that was taught to me in the 80s, except that there is value to meditation. So,
So you still have Satan in your heart then, and
yes, yeah.
that's obviously,
I feel like
20
you can
minutes a
see
day.
it.
Yeah, for sure, for
I
sure.
mean,
So,
it
so
sounds
would
awesome
you?
though. Like if Satan were with me, like, don't you think I would be more powerful? No.
Yeah, well,
If he existed.
if he existed, exactly right. So,
Right.
so Claire, would you use the word cult to describe your upbringing?
I don't, well, first of all, my mom still lives there, so there was some delicacy in releasing that book. And lots of people do call it a cult. I call it a new religious movement. I mean, cult is like tricky in that it's about insiders calling outsiders out, like saying like, oh, you don't belong, but we belong. So for example, I mean, Aimee Semple McPherson, we're going to talk about this book, I think in the teens and 20s, lots of Christians would have called Pentecostals a cult. And now, it's a quarter of the world's Christian. So people don't call it a cult anymore. So I just find that a
We
little
do.
tricky. Okay, fine.
Yeah, we totally do. Although we will say you can have, it's a spectrum, right? So you can have more
Right.
moderate forms and
Yes.
certainly more controlling forms. Yeah. Okay,
Yeah,
cool.
it was
Well,
not high control. That would be, I would say. It was very easy for
yeah.
me to leave. I just left.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, well, that's really what makes a cult, isn't it? At least
Yeah.
in that sort of definition. Hey, so let's talk about your book, because that's why we've got you here. And we've definitely come across Aimee Semple McPherson on our podcast before. That name has come up on more than one occasion. And anyone who has read into Pentecostal history will at least be familiar with her name. But for the rest of us, tell us, who was Aimee Semple McPherson, and how did you first encounter her story? What brought you to her?
So Aimee Semple McPherson, she was born in 1890 and died in 1944, and was sort of at the height of her fame in the 1920s in Los Angeles. And she was actually a Canadian woman. She was from rural Canada who came to America and then ultimately sort of took up residency in Los Angeles, and there started what is arguably the first megachurch in the modern era, and started one of the first Christian radio stations. And she was just this incredible pioneer, first of all, bringing, I would say, Pentecostalism to the masses, to the kind of white middle class. She was also a real pioneer in terms of using entertainment and technology to spread the gospel. She was a real innovator. So she, besides using her radio station, she also did these massive illustrated sermons, these like grand spectacles in her church where 5, 10, 15,000 people would come to watch her do these incredibly dramatic interpretations. She had a huge band, a huge chorus. And so she was just a real pioneer of kind of what we think of today in a lot of ways of Christian entertainment and, yeah, like evangelical worship culture, I would say. But I mean, you guys know more about that than I do, but that would be my understanding of things.
Well, it was interesting, like thinking about it. I mean, Troy's done a lot more study than me at Bible college, but I certainly remember in my short time at Bible college not really hearing about Aimee Semple McPherson. Certainly not the detail. I mean, the detail in your book and the insight you give to who she was as a person. I mean, Troy, can you remember much about Aimee that you were taught at Bible
Yeah,
college?
well, not so much from Bible college, though a little bit, but more because of my own study into the Revival Centre, which is this Australian Pentecostal cult that I was involved in. So for me, actually, and this has what helped me bring me, out of Pentecostalism, was understanding that there was these streams that fed into the history of these groups. And of course, Foursquare Gospel and Aimee Semple McPherson were, I mean, these are big names. These are, that anyone who knows anything about Pentecostal history will know. But that said, what I have found, of course, being on the outside of the church now and, looking at it from another perspective, is the scandal was all covered up. So she was just, basically it's like hagiographies, it's like these histories of saints that have been written. The same thing we see with Keith Green, Brian, in that we hear all the wonderful things, but you don't hear the dirt, and you don't hear the damage that was done, or etc. So that's what's amazing, I think, about Claire's book. And also, when we've had other people that have written books on the history of Pentecostalism, even they brushed over her disappearance. Oh yeah, she disappeared and there was a bit of a scandal, and that was it. And this was by a secular author, a non-religious author. So to actually go in depth onto this, and I found it fascinating, really. And it's just, to me, Claire, it just seems to be more of the same in terms of what we see today. It's just it was happening back then, and so these people weren't saints; they were just humans.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things to say there. I'm so excited about this conversation, to like pace myself. But first of all, I mean, part of my decision to write this book was, I had heard about her when I was in divinity school. I went to like a secular academic program in Chicago, but she was mentioned, and it was just kind of her role in Christian entertainment, like her as this kind of pioneer of what we think of as like sort of the spectacle of evangelical Christian entertainment today. But there was nothing about her scandal. And I didn't learn about her scandal until after I lived in Los Angeles. I was working at the Los Angeles Times, and I would drive by her church every day on my way to work. And that's when I started researching her. And what I found was so interesting was that the books often were, or the things written about her were divided. Like there are these scathing biography. There's a scathing biography of her from the 30s while she was still alive by a female journalist, where like, I mean, it's filled with amazing facts, but like every sentence she's just condemning. She can barely get the facts out because her like hatred of Amy is like so intense. But there's like lots of information in it. And then, you know, you start having like what you said, like these sort of hagiographies. So like there was a book that was taught in the PhD program, which I was not in at Chicago, that they read by Edith Bloomhofer. And I think that she had like literally a paragraph on the trial, right? And so it's like, you know, all this stuff about her incredible good works and all her achievements, which are real and significant, but like then just kind of glossing over it. And so I found like that was sort of part of my decision to do the book, because there has been things written about her over the years, but like, wait, can't all of these things be true? Like, can't we tell a story where all of these things are true? Like she is, you know, made some terrible decisions, had like real sort of shady business practices, and also fed 1.5 million people during the Great Depression, and was like a true believer who really thought she was healing people. Like, can all that be true? So that was kind of my project. And yeah, I would just say, like, even in the Foursquare Church, I have visited a number of times. I went to their centennial celebration. I've been to services over the years that I've been working on it. And Aimee is not like a big part of what they talk about. And yes, the answer to that is like, I think there is a sense of shame around her scandal and not wanting to kind of open that can of worms, because there's a discomfort with her two aspects, I would say. I mean, that's sort of the reason for the name of the book, Sister Sinner, is that she contained all of it.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like evangelicals do with the Bible, they'll pull out some good bits and then they'll push the shit bits to the side. And I found that with Sister Aimee. It was the same sort of thing. I remember the very few times that I heard about her or read about her when I was involved in the movement was, see, we do put women up there. We're fine with women in leadership. They're okay. You know, we're practically feminists. So it was that sort of thing that they would roll out. And it wasn't until much later that I started to find that she was as dodgy as fuck. Like it was some of, and I really want to dig into some of those dodgy things. And
Mhm.
again, I encourage people to read the book because it drew me in. I was just like, this woman is as shifty as a shithouse rat, as we would say in Australia. And it was incredible what she got away with because there was this veneer of her being a saint, essentially. And you know, like all complex characters, they do good stuff, which makes you look away from the other stuff they're doing. And we see that we saw it with televangelists, you know, through the 80s and 90s, and we still see it with some of those Christian megastars today. But you talked about sort of balancing that whole her complexity when you're writing. So can you talk us through some of those biggest challenges you faced in your research, given that you do have all these conflicting stories dependent on whose work you're reading?
Yeah, I mean, it was challenging. I tried to piece together the narrative of her life based on the facts, as much as you can call them that, right? And that, so, you know, I relied heavily on court transcripts and newspaper articles. Um, and of course, I mean, she wrote like 6 or 7 memoirs, so there's her layers on top of it. And for her earlier life, I didn't have much choice. Like, there's no real record of her besides her recollections of that time, which, you know, are her own kind of form of hagiography. um, but, you know, I think I do. I mean, I think my version of feminism, but like maybe it's also just about people, is like I like that she was both. Like I like that she got lost along the way, you know, and she tried to find her way back. I mean, that's more of how I see it. You know, I think she really became untethered from her self. Like her head really got turned by the experience of being treated like a prophet and a divine healer, and then later being so squarely in the public eye. I mean, which is the other thing about this book. It's also sort of even as much as it's about religion, it's also about fame and how corrosive it can be. But I don't find, I feel like I think it's kind of cool that she was good and bad. I did an event last week in Cambridge with Henry Louis Gates, the prominent African American historian, and he was like, I think this is the most interesting white woman I've ever heard of. And I was like, I agree. Like, she's a great story. Like, and it's 100 years ago, so I felt far from like indignation or outrage, which might be easy. Like 100 years kind of softens things, like, but I'm curious on your thoughts. Cause for me, I'm kind of like, yeah, it was a long time ago.
Again, Brian and I almost talked over each other before, and we're both going to start with it's interesting because, but it is interesting because, right? And I have this belief in it. It's not an idea I came up with. It was one that I read from someone else, but the idea that Pentecostalism is one of these organizations or one of these movements that is, in air quotes, historyless. And what that means is it's not that they don't have a history, it's that they don't want to know their own history, right?
Yeah.
And so for a lot of people, they open up the Bible and, they get to the end of the Bible, the end of Revelation. That's the end, end of the first century and then the 20th century. And then we all start speaking in tongues and off we go kind of thing. And of course, that's not the way it happened. You've got, it's millennia of church history that's feeding into this. You've got stories like Aimee Semple McPherson and others. You've got the revivals where the tongues, stuff all happens, etc. Anyway, where I'm going with all this is to say that I think what happens for a lot of people is that they take what they think is beneficial to the narrative, beneficial to what we're trying to achieve today. And again, without blowing smoke, Claire, this is why what you're doing is really important. And were you to write a scathing biography like this one that you came across, the Pentecostals are just going to ignore it. So the fact that you're able to combine the good and the bad, I think has value, not just to us on the outside going, yeah, tell us what really happened, but also for people on the inside. But I think the other thing too that's interesting is, and thank you for correcting my inability to say the word hagiography a moment ago. I
I
think
didn't even
it's
notice.
yeah, I did. I think it's interesting that they still do promote this idea of this perfection, and so we see that today. Everyone's so shocked when Jimmy Swaggart falls, or so shocked when they find
Right.
out Kenneth Copeland has all these airplanes, and it's the same sort of thing with this. And yet, it's just the common story. This is what
Yeah.
we're dealing with. Yeah. Did you want to speak to that?
I mean, I have this kind of incendiary theory just based on where like my experience growing up and writing that first book, and it's not a totalizing idea, and I feel like I'm immediately gonna regret saying this, but I think it's really interesting to think about the role that people like the audience, the people, the church members play in the fall of these people. You know what I mean? Like, I mean, so like with Maharishi, the guru of the Transcendental meditation movement, I mean, he's sort of famously screwed up, right? Like, so there's the Beatles were in Rishikesh with him, and he supposedly hit on Mia Farrow or her sister, and they wrote the song "Sexy Sadie," and there's supposedly it was originally had Marishi's name, and they swapped it out, and so it's like a classic 20th century story of people being let down by their guru, right? And I think that was always my sense growing up. Like when I say like, was I a teenage fundamentalist? I was a teenage nihilist. Like I had so much blame, and for really good reason, I should say. Like there was a lot of victimization and people who gave up their lives and spent all their money on products and a lifestyle that essentially was just being funneled into the coffers of the TM movement, right? So I totally stand by those issues, but I do think it's interesting to think about what our expectations are of these people and the way that we treat them, how that can kind of deform them in some ways. Like it makes them lose themselves a little bit. And so I think it's so interesting with these people, and especially, I mean, Christianity, like it's such an interesting one. Like Aimee, the day that she disappeared, she was working on this sermon. I'm sure you read this, Light and Darkness. And I feel like, I mean, maybe I'm overthinking it, but I see it as like this, her wrestling with this binary view of the world. And I think that binary view, it's really unrealistic, and I think it's really it really messes with people's heads, right? Like and she herself said at one point, like, either I am good or I am evil. And it's like, well, don't all people contain all things? I don't know. So did that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. And I mean, it prompts further questions because we talk a lot about narcissism within Pentecostalism and within evangelicalism. And so it just makes me wonder, and I don't know how much we've explored this, Brian. In fact, probably not at all, that what role does the church have, or what role does the congregation have in building these people up? I mean, we definitely know there's a whole heap of sycophants, but we've always put it as the person that's drawing being the evil one, right? It's the
Right.
narcissist up the front. But there's a
Yeah.
dynamic here. I mean,
Oh,
that's what you're speaking to, right?
Yeah.
totally. When I think of Aimee, I mean, you read about her upbringing. Like there was poverty, there was trauma and tragedy, and losing a husband, and all of that sort of thing, which I think would build part of her persona as well, and her response to that fame. I mean, you see a little bit, and you go, "Oh, okay, let's try something else, and I can build that more and more." And all of a sudden, she becomes a megastar. And of course, we've got it within all of us that we would love that. We would love that attention, that fame, that money. Who knows necessarily what went on behind the scenes with everything? Like, was she manipulating the masses? Yeah, probably. Fairly good chance, let's be honest. But I agree. Like exploring what was people's innate needs that actually fed that, encouraged it, and built it for her as well. So I think that's a good place to explore as well. What are your thoughts on that, Claire?
Well, I have given this example before. Like I left the Transcendental meditation movement and kind of gone on with my life. And in my 20s, I did start to get back into meditation, but I was interested in different kinds of meditation. Like, does it have to be TM? And I started going to these week-long meditation retreats, kind of Zen Buddhist, and, very little ideology. And there was this guy who was running it who I really liked, and it felt like, just basic mechanics. He felt like very egoless, so to speak. And then one day I came into the lecture, and people are waiting for him to walk up on the stage and sit in a chair and give his talk. And he walks in, through the chairs, and a woman walks behind him, falls to her knees, and kisses the ground where he walked. And I was like, fuck, I gotta leave. Like, I can't be here anymore. Like, and I'm like, he should have stopped that the second it happened, and he didn't. And they're just, then I was there for a few more days, and it just, you started to see more and more of it. And I never went back because I think, and that's just kind of my issue. As much as I like admire religion and honor religious experience and like to think about it and study it and learn it, I also am like, I don't like, what is that impulse to put people on a pedestal? Like, why do we do that? Why do we decide that they're more connected to God than we are? Like, that they are more connected to profound truths than those that we know ourselves? Yeah, so that's where I just think it's like an area worthy of inquiry, because of course these people are solipsistic narcissists, and of course I mean, they're also often really talented, like there's a talent to it. There is a natural charisma and a natural ability to connect with people that's really interesting. I mean, I learned while I was working on this that Aimee like didn't particularly like to be alone with people. She really just liked to be in a crowd. And as a biographer, it was kind of tricky because she didn't leave like any private papers or any secret thoughts, like and they were like everything she thought she just put in the magazine or put in a sermon. Like it was just like to the world. Like that was her sense of herself. And like that's not something I particularly would want to be around, but I think it's like a fantastic character, you know?
Well, you see it in Pentecostal movements now, and both Troy and I definitely experienced it where you were handpicked if you had charisma. You were handpicked if you could further the movement. If you had some sort of gift, so to speak, that could expand the kingdom, then you were definitely tapped on the shoulder. It was something that was identified. It was revered within the movement as well, and still is undoubtedly, because that will definitely be advantageous to the movement. So I would imagine that that was back then as well.
For sure. Yeah. And she, I mean, I don't know if you read this towards the end of the book. She ends up recruiting this young Mexican American kid to be like her translator and a youth pastor. And he is in awe of her and talks about her endlessly. And he goes on to become Anthony Quinn, who's like a very famous American movie actor from the 50s and 60s. But she saw and kind of spotted right away his talent and star power. Like he was a member of the orchestra, and she was like, you. So, I mean, I think there's also a thing with Pentecostalism, my understanding of it, which is that there is this kind of performance aspect, right? Like you are manifesting an interaction with the divine, right? Like you're physically manifesting that. So it is like different than other Christian services, I would say, right? Like where you like there's just this experience, and the individual is having this experience, but you also have a leader who's supposed to perform that experience and bring people into it, which is really interesting. And by the way, like I think is probably the future of religion, is this like very individualized, intense, physical experiences. Like I sort of see that seems like the way things are going, just based on my
Claire,
observation.
Claire,
Yeah.
I've got to point out to you, for someone that's outside the circle, we only use, or as Pentecostals, we only use the word manifest when we're talking about the devil, not talking
Sorry.
about God. No, don't. It's okay. Don't apologize.
I
We're
was
not
like,
in
is
there
that too new
anymore. Okay.
agey?
Yeah. No, we're not in there anymore. So yeah, so when you say, it's funny because when we were in the church and you talk about manifesting, it's always the devil. Whereas now, of course, all these kids are out here, manifesting on TikTok, and
Yeah.
I think to myself, the Pentecostals and other Christians must be looking at that, going, yes, they're manifesting, all right. They certainly
Yeah.
are. Hey, but I guess another thing that I want to sort of talk about and sort of come back to was the idea of this, personalities, right? And personalities and the way that they're lauded. I can remember back in church once, and I think it was as I was sort of waking up to it all, I got up because I used to sing right in church. And I got up and I said once about how we put these people up as ministers and we put them on pedestals, and then we just want to knock them down, and we need to be really careful because they're not God, etc. I was actually called in by the minister and scolded for what I said on the following Tuesday, right? For actually saying that. So it's interesting that you're seeing that happening, and for some, and somehow I think they're seeing it too, but they're threatened by people that are actually identifying it. So what's been the pushback from the Christians in terms of your book? Are people pushing back against it, or has it been welcomed?
It's a great question. I mean, there definitely, I would say, in the like months leading up to publication, there was interest from, Christian entertainment outlets. And then they requested copies of the book and were like, we'll pass, which I was disappointed in.
Not
Although
surprising.
a friend of mine was like, you're an idiot for ever thinking otherwise, but whatever. And then I heard from the Foursquare Church like 10 days ago. I'm been very much in touch mostly with the archivist who runs her, like the head of the archive, who's a lovely man. And actually, like his kindness during this process and his openness, as much as he was able to be open, was meaningful. Like it was, if nothing else, like very tactically smart in that, like it made me respect him and the work that they were doing. He just was wonderful. But the feedback from the board was that, that I got an A on my history. But the mistake I made was that I cast Aimee as the healer instead of Jesus,
Of
which I had
course.
to I know, I was like, I don't know what that means.
She must
I was
become
like, wait,
less so Jesus can become more. It's that
right.
sort of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I think yeah, I
In
guess it's
case
a
you didn't realize,
perspective.
Claire, Brian
Yeah.
just quoted the Bible
I
at
did.
you.
I
In
did.
case you
Oh,
missed
is
that, yeah.
that from the Bible?
Yeah, he must become less, so I must become less, so he may become more. Yeah.
Uh,
So
Well,
that's where they would have been.
she would say this thing about how she wasn't the healer, she was just the office girl in the waiting room letting people in to see Jesus, which is just like
Yeah.
perfectly that, which I put in there. So I'm like, wait, I said that, but I don't know. I guess it was an idea that maybe didn't infuse the entire book also, maybe.
You should have said to them, if Jesus had turned up, I would have given him a cameo in the book. But the fact is, he didn't turn up because he doesn't exist, people. That's why. Well, he does. He just died a long time
Yeah,
ago.
exactly. He's
Yeah,
dead.
way to win the four square board, Brian.
I know,
Way to
right?
win the
Right.
four
Yeah,
square board.
exactly. I don't think I would have said that. The other thing that, I had this kind of back and forth with them where I was saying, like, I've actually, the criticism I've received more, like in, like, obviously secular press and reviews, which have been mostly good, but has been this thing about me not sort of officially condemning her in the pages, which I find like kind of misses the point to me a little bit, but I'd be happy to talk about that with you guys. But the church said, like the archivist, when I told him that, said, oh, actually the main thing that we hear in terms of criticism about Aimee, which answers some of your earlier questions, is that she was a heretic for preaching at all because she was a woman. And so everything that came after with her and her troubles, so to speak, was, God's wrath and punishment for her preaching at all.
Yeah, yeah, which speaks to the fact that you're lucky to be even on our podcast, Claire. But But yeah, that's right. There's the whole woman thing, and that's what Brian was saying at the very beginning. It's like, oh yeah, we're Pentecostals. We've had women from the beginning. Of course, we don't have any now, or
Right.
in some churches anyway. Okay, so I'm putting myself into the sort of seat of the audience right now, and some people might be going, "What scandal?" So do you
Right.
want to just, and look, it's not a reveal because your book basically goes in depth and around this. And I think, it's not a reveal at all. But tell us, what was the scandal and was there sex?
Yes, there was. I mean, that's usually my elevator pitches. I'm like, she started the first mega church in America and she had the 20th century's first sex scandal, which is more debatable, the first sex scandal, but that's my elevator pitch. Um, yes, and I never feel like I'm giving a spoiler because I feel like the facts of what happened are so insane that there's no way I could summarize what happens in this story. It's like that trial is the craziest story. Like I had trouble fitting it all in. But the basic facts of the scandal are in May of 1926, at the height of her fame, she went down to the beach to swim with her assistant. And it was something she'd done. She'd been kind of exhausted and, becoming more and more famous, more and more isolated. And she had taken to swimming laps on the beach on many afternoons. And she sent her assistant away to make a phone call. And while her assistant was gone, she walked into the water and she vanished. And she was mourned for dead. There was a huge vigil on the beach over the coming days. Tens of thousands of people came down. The city spared no expense. They searched the ocean floor. They had helicopters and planes. 2 people died looking for her. Huge newspaper coverage, both in Los Angeles and actually all over the world. There was a memorial service held for her that raised $500,000. And 3 days after the memorial service, 35 days after she had walked into the ocean, she walked out of the desert in Mexico, 600 miles away, with this kind of unbelievable story of being kidnapped into what she called white slavery by a group of people from the underworld who called themselves the Avengers, and that she had been punished for her good acts and tortured. But she was like, right away, there were a lot of questions. Like, she didn't ask for water. She was like wearing like a clean white dress and a corset. Her shoes were fine, but she said she had run through the desert for, I can't remember, like 15 hours or something crazy. So just questions right away. And sort of the core of the book, I mean, I sort of chart her rise and her story of how she became who she was. But the core of the book is this series of court inquiries that, until the Manson murders, were the most expensive in Los Angeles's history, and which initially started out with them trying to find out who the kidnappers were, but very quickly became kind of like it turned on Aimee. And ultimately, she and her mother and her alleged lover slash former employee, plus a schizophrenic doppelganger, were all charged with fraud and perjury for making up the whole story, and that actually Aimee had run away to Northern California with her alleged lover, this guy who'd been her radio operator, to live in a love shack for 10 days and have sex. That's the sex. There's like, but yeah, there's a lot more, but that's my really long elevator pitch on the scandal.
It's a crazy, crazy story. But you've done a heap of research. You've done a lot of reading. What do you think happened from what you read and you've been able to gather?
Well, I would say two things. I think it's, first of all, it's unknowable in some ways, right? Like, everybody's dead. She's dead. She's not here to tell us what actually happened. She told the same story over and over, pretty much exactly the same way for her entire life. So she stuck by her story. I will parenthetically say that a friend of mine who's Cuban just was telling me, he's reading the book, and he was like, I got chills because I defected from Cuba in the 80s and I had to make up this story. And I told the story so many times that I believed that story. I have like sense memories of this story that I had to tell to save my life. So I think there's an aspect of that with Aimee, in terms of, like, people always say, like, oh, was she knowingly lying? Like, did she actually, like, what did she actually think? Like, that's my impression of it based on my research. I think, yes, she got fed up with being confined, living in a little 2-bedroom apartment with her mother. I think she was a 35-year-old woman in her prime who had an affair, but didn't have like the sense of self to allow that to have been true. And so this other story came out, and she told that story for the rest of her life. But I feel like you guys are going to be mad at me about that. Like, that am I letting her
No,
off the hook if I say that?
no, I don't think so at all. Because what's interesting about her is that she had this sort of Christian credibility as well. I mean, people will read the book and see that she was a missionary in China for
I
a
mean,
long time. She was a doting, loving wife for a long time. But I think the other thing that struck me in your book was she was mainstream. Like, she was famous in Los Angeles and and the US, and I think that's sometimes overlooked as well, because we can see it from a Pentecostal perspective. I mean, no, we look at people like Swaggart, and we look at people like Kenneth Copeland and these others, and yes, they're known, but they're not known as well as they're known within our world. But that wasn't true for her. So when you talk about this being a scandal, this was a huge scandal.
yeah, I mean, there's surveys that were done that showed that she was either the most famous woman in America, or number two after whatever actress it was of the day. So she was she made herself well known. Her radio station was heard all over the Western United States. You know, she visited New York. She visited Australia at least twice, by the way. Once while she was building Angelus Temple. So I think, I mean, you say she was mass, and I think there's a really important kind of undercurrent there, which, so like, what does it mean to start the first megachurch? I mean, first of all, it's this idea of the church as this like almost city unto itself, right? So she had 26 departments, you know, she had publishing, she had education, you know, she had marketing and outreach, you know, it was just this kind of sense of the church becoming all things, and a huge emphasis on entertainment, right? Like just a huge choir, a huge orchestra, dancers, choreographers, script writers. You know, I mean, it was just this, there was nothing else like it. I mean, people called her the P.T. Barnum of Christianity for that reason. Um, but I bring it up because when you say she was mass, what is really interesting to me about her is that it's this kind of moment of the creation of mass in some ways, or certainly a formative thing that we kind of take for granted or assume today of like, oh, there's
You
mass
mean beyond
consumption.
Christianity? You're talking like mass
Yeah.
media as we know it today
Yes.
was created through this.
Well, created, I'm saying it was being created at that moment, right? Like, so you have, I mean, at least in America, like Los Angeles was this tiny, shitty little city, right? It was barely even a city. And in the 1920s, it became the fastest growing city in the history of the world. And you have all these people who have been disconnected in kind of rural America and beyond from all over the world. So not living together in big communities, not living together in cities, right? Not being spoken to as one. And radio and the sort of like early 20th century journalism started to create this sense of mass. I think that's what I'm saying. So like especially radio, right? They called it the door handle to the living room of people, this idea that you could reach just huge numbers of people. So you're not having a sort of small regional experience, right? She wasn't regionally famous. She was famous all over the country. Like she was being written about in Vanity Fair and the New Yorker. And so that kind of celebrity and that kind of fame was also just being created. Of course, there were people from the 19th century who every American, for example, knew, or I'm sure in Australia, there was, you know, people that were known, but it was just like the creation of this kind of landscape of or not landscape, I would say like constellation of public figures. And it's happening because of the technology and because of urbanization. it, does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. So a massive shift, if not a creation, then a massive shift in the idea of celebrity, basically.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. A massive shift. I mean, I don't know what celebrity looked like in the 19th century. I mean, I have some sense, but it's just, I think what we think of today, where it's like me and my cousin in Florida and my aunt in Northern California, and like, you know, all of us know the same people, right? And that's what I'm talking about, like that shift of like a constellation of public figures, which the media was helping to create, and these new technologies. And Aimee really understood that. She always said, you know, I want to have the largest microphone possible, and I want to fall madly in love. Or sometimes she would say, I want a husband. Those were her twin desires. Um, but that I desire for the largest microphone possible was like really dovetailed at this moment in the early 20th century, where yeah, you're just suddenly able to reach huge numbers of people.
Would you be able to draw any parallels with contemporary figures, either within the church or outside the church, that you could say this is what Aimee was like? And I realize you're saying it's sort of, you know, it was a beginning stage, it was a proto to what we have now, but just, you know, for people listening, who was she like? Are we talking sort of Angelina Jolie? Are we talking Donald Trump? How big?
Yeah, I think I mean, Donald Trump is an interesting one in that people were very divided on her. Like they either loved her or hated her. And she had this sort of ability to connect, with this idea of the everyman folks. Like that was the thing. And she really worked with nostalgia quite a bit. So at once she was like conjuring this kind of farm rural life that she had grown up in, but using state-of-the-art technology to connect directly to her audiences. So I see the same um, savviness that you see in Trump, where he's really good at speaking to people where they are, but projecting forward a better version of themselves. But in terms of people today, I mean, I often mention Paula White, who is Trump's faith advisor and a charismatic Christian, and she's a televangelist. But I think, yeah, Joel Osteen or Rick Warren, and I mean, any of these big um, leaders of churches who kind of use themselves as platforms. So that also includes people like Oprah or Gwyneth Paltrow, where it's like you're kind of buying them. Like, her most repeated, most famous sermon was called "The Story of My Life," and she would just tell the story of her life. Like that was her sermon.
I mean, if there's one thing Pentecostals love, it is fame. And if they can't obtain fame within their own rights, they'll definitely convert and co-opt. So we saw that particularly with Hillsong with Justin Bieber, Chance the Rapper, so it was all about, look what we've done. And then they would try and ride those coattails of fame. What influence do you think? Because, obviously, we're digging into 100 years ago, she was using influence, she was using media, cutting edge technology back then. What sort of things do you think have transposed to now and the learnings, whether it's something they consciously learned from Sister Aimee, or whether it's some of those learnings that have carried on through time that have really built to today's Pentecostal mega fame type personalities?
Well, I do think this idea of no middleman, right? Like she was, so in 1916, she started her first, she started a magazine called Bridal Call, right? And, um, she was quite young. She had no money, and she had submitted just like a few articles to other Pentecostal magazines. But very quickly, she had this instinct to have it be hers, to have no middleman, to be like a direct to consumer person and to control the means of production. And I think that is something that you really see today, right? Of like, I'm not going to try and get an interview with the New York Times. I'm not going to try and place an editorial, in Time magazine. I'm going to start my own new Substack. I'm going to start my own newsletter. I'm going to start my own um, my own media. So I think that like it's really basic, but it's like that was a real shift. And it didn't, she started it and had that. And then I think, Pentecostalism wasn't like just an up and to the right growth trajectory. I mean, you guys know this better than I do, right? But like, she really brought it to the masses in Los Angeles, but she also started to hold back on a lot of the sort of more like there was speaking in tongues just happened in a specific room. After a while, it was less of like a main stage event. Same for the divine healings, like that they weren't something that as she became more mainstream, I think she held back on some of that more.
Which is exactly what Hillsong did, by the way.
Yeah.
Hillsong, it became, I even heard Brian Houston say things like the spiritual gifts and tongues happens more in the home groups, in people's houses, not
Mm.
at the main services. So it's just fascinating that the parallels are the same. And I bet totally unaware they followed the same track.
Yeah, I mean it is. I mean, I think there is again, you tell me. I'm just like a journalist, but my sense in general for evangelicals and certainly for Christians, like, it is a numbers game, right? Like you're trying to convert as many people as possible. You're trying to get as many people to have these experiences with the Holy Spirit. So,
Yep.
Or download our podcast.
or buy that merch.
Yeah, that's right.
We are ex-penties, and we joke it's all about the numbers.
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah, but it is, I mean, that isn't true of all faiths, right? It is a bit of a signature. And I think that's like what dovetails so interestingly with mass consumption. But I mean, the truth is, like, speaking in tongues is strange, right? Like, it's a very odd thing. It can frighten people, you know?
Yeah.
So I get why, as these churches become more mainstream, why they're like, go do it in the back room.
Yeah, it's crazy shit.
Yeah, I've I've got another question for you. And
Yeah.
by the way, speaking of crazy shit, it was interesting. You do speak about speaking in tongues, especially at the beginning of the book with her own experience. But my next question to you, I guess, is where did she end with the scandal? Like, was that her demise, or did she rebound? Was it very Trumpian that it doesn't matter what I do, my loyalists are going to continue to be loyal?
Yeah, I mean, it's almost all of those things. She did rebound. The charges were ultimately dismissed, and she traveled the world on a victory tour. But she had been changed by the scandal. I mean, I think that's probably one of the most interesting things about her story, is this way that on one hand she was very Trumpian, and that she like stuck to her version of reality and repeated it, and began to attack her enemies and really make it about this vast conspiracy to take her down. But at the same time, you see her absorb the criticism. So, like, in a very sort of female way, after the trial, she goes on like a big diet. Like, part of the trial, there were a lot of like there was a lot of commentary on her body and her looks, in negative ways. So I think within a year of that trial, she went on an all orange juice diet, and lost a ton of weight, had kind of celluloid dreams of making a movie about her life. Within 3 years, she got a facelift with her mother, which a facelift in 1930s was like a pretty radical thing. And you can see it, like, she looks really different. I mean, this picture from the cover of her, like, this is post facelift. And if you look in this inside, like the older photographs of her, it looks like a completely different person. And she becomes very physically frail. On top of that, I mean, she has this kind of falling out with her mother, who'd been this like real sort of momager, and who'd really provided a lot of business acumen and structure to her life. They have their issues and kind of get back together, fall apart. There's a whole thing. But she starts to become very commercial. Like, a lot of people, I think, approached her to try and capitalize on her fame or infamy. So she starts a cruise line, she starts a hotel line, she starts a vacation rental business. She has a Broadway show, she tries to start her own Hollywood movie studio. Like, so yeah, she really tried to capitalize and commodify it. But she was also like, I mean, I think she also, her family said, like, look, she's like a dreamy, gullible person. Like, she could be talked into anything. And I don't know if that's exactly true, but I think there was there was a way in which she was like an artist, and you get this feeling after the scandal where, like, all the kind of crows came to feed off of her infamy, and it gets pretty dark. And she ends up, I mean, incredible travel schedule, incredible outreach, incredible social services. So, just like to say, it's complicated. Like, it's not a totally black and white picture of like she was good and she became bad. Like, the people's lives she touched during that time. I think there was a point in the 1930s where she administered to 1 out of 10 Americans, which is pretty shocking. But at the same time, she starts having all these nervous breakdowns. I think she died of a overdose of prescription pills. And you get the feeling that was probably part of her regimen. She was in a conservatorship for the last 7 years of her life, so she signed on off all her financial and personal power to her business manager. So it's a weird, it's like a complex ending. You know what I mean?
Yeah, she was Brittany and Marilyn
Yes,
and all these
yeah,
other people all rolled into one.
yeah. She's like this is just why she's like such a great figure, and also just like the proto-ness of it all. I mean, she filed for in the spring of 1944, she fired her conservator, put her son in charge, and filed for a television license. And so she would have been this crazy televangelist. Like she almost got there, you know. But I think there is something about this like early kind of formation where you just see all these different strands that we see today happening kind of all at once, if that makes sense.
There was certainly no one like her. That's for sure. And I mean, the story's incredible. But what it's done for you too is you've had a bit of a peek behind the curtain, obviously, of this movement, and obviously of someone so influential in the movement. What's that done for your own views or opinions of faith, media, and her public persona?
Yeah, I mean, I was with a group of biographers recently, and they were all saying how connected they felt to their subject and how much like they saw themselves in the person they were writing about. And I was like, I don't feel that at all. Like, I feel like she was my opposite. Like, I feel like if we walked down the street, we would just be like two completely different people, you know? Like, I enjoy small groups of people and long, small conversations, you know, and she was kind of a squawk box. I mean, Dorothy Parker called her Our Lady of the Loudspeaker, you know. I mean, she was really loud, and she really was focused outward in a way that is kind of the opposite of how I've lived my life. But I think, I mean, you know, I live in America in 2025, and that is a really specific experience right now. You know, I mean, people are, um, I would say people in my life are scared and they're outraged and they're really angry. But they feel powerless. And promoting this book during that time, I think I have thought about like how to have less outrage, because I see how the outrage in 1926 served no one, right? And there is this like Trumpy aspect to the trial, right? Where people are like, just admit that you're lying, like admit that you're lying. And she's like, no, uh, you all are evil. That's why you want me to say that. So there's something about that lens that for me has made me, um, yeah, just be a little more interested in less reacting, I would say, and more thinking about like what actually works is putting out a vision, is what I've seen, right? Like, so Trump has a vision right now that has really captured people's imaginations. And the truth is, his political opponents, which would include me, spend a lot of time shouting about all the things that are wrong with the vision, but that does not work. Like the outrage doesn't work, the pointing out the lies doesn't work. Like I think that when you're speaking to large numbers of people, what works is yeah, like a vision, like it's your own synthetic complete vision of reality versus outrage. So that's where I'm at. Does that make sense?
It does.
Yeah.
One of the things that a lot of our listeners would be wrestling with or have wrestled with is just making sense of the experience. And one of the things that I found was that the histories of these movements are oftentimes covered up or sanitized or even just, you know, totally rewritten. And so part of my process was to actually go back and have a look at what happened at the, the birth of Pentecostalism, and then what happened with, with evangelicalism, and then what happened going further back with, the Protestant Reformation, and every stage I went back, I realized there was no perfection here. There was no perfection at this stage. There was no, but yet from this point here, a lot of people will look back with this, more than sanitized, with this glorious version of how the history was. And I think what your book does for people in our space, people that have left and are trying to make sense of their years in Pentecostalism, is it helps show the history. It helps show the reality. And this is actually what happened. This is where it all came from. And I know you didn't write it for this reason, Claire, but that's really powerful for a lot of us because it opens our eyes to the fact that it's not me, it's them. Right. And even from the very beginning, it was flawed. And you saw this in the way that you were dealing with the Foursquare movement in telling this story, as they were very careful about what you're going to say and how you're going to say it, because they've guarded this for so long. And even, dare I say, probably a lot of people that are, in air quotes, guarding, they don't even know what they're guarding anymore because it's been lost to time. So digging this up is awesome.
Well, I do think there is something about embracing like the dark side that I think is pretty wonderful and really empowering, right? Like, I mean, there's a way in which I feel like there's a feminist project with Aimee where I'm like, hey, there's a really important American leader in history who no one has learned about because she fucked up. And like I want that for my kids. Like I want them to be like, hey, I can make a terrible mistake and still have a life and be a relevant person. Like you aren't actually good or bad. Like being human is a very complex thing. And you do see it in history. I mean, the founding of Pentecostalism is so interesting and kind of heartbreaking. Like the story of the schism and how Assemblies of God and Church of God in Christ separated, right? And a lot of it was about racism and white supremacy. The original vision was honestly like there is beauty to it. I mean, it's not my world, but like these stories of the Azusa Street revivals have a lot of magic to them, and there is this kind of unexplainable wonder to it. And yet, like as soon as there's power, it becomes contested, and that's like sort of the refrain of history.
Yeah, it is a fascinating story, Amy's, but also the Pentecostal movement, as you point out, is just an incredible one. Is there any one? What's next for you, Claire? Are you looking at any figures to write about, another biography or subjects? Give us a bit of a teaser on what's on in your mind at the moment.
Yeah. I've been weirdly this entire time I've been working on this, I've been working on a novel, so I'm trying to like actually wrap it up, and it takes place in a new age yoga sex cult, and it has a detective, and it's definitely like drawing on my own. I mean, there was no sex cult in TM, but it's sort of I'm processing my own issues through it. Yeah. And then in terms of the nonfiction work, I mean, I'm really interested in the way that people trap themselves or find themselves trapped. That's what I would be my teaser. That's where I'm looking next.
Brilliant. I like the fact that we end up. I don't know if you noticed, but when you were telling your story, then Brian and my eyes both lit up with yoga sex cult, because I think that's always fun to read about. That's right.
Just
hey, so
here, prepay now.
Yeah.
I even have my own merch.
Yeah, I'll get AI to write it for me. So Claire, your book, Sister Sinner, The Miraculous Life and Mysterious Disappearance of Aimee Semple McPherson, is available wherever people get their books and, of course, online. When we often will say to people, hey, it's a great book, but this is more than that. This is a really good book, especially if you're coming from a Pentecostal background. So we do recommend that you dig in. And even if you're not, it's a really, really good story.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I love this conversation.
No, thank you. Read the book, people. Read the book. If you'd like to connect with the I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist podcast, then please see the links in our link tree in the show notes. We invite you to join our listener community on Facebook, and we're also on Instagram, X, and Reddit. Check out our merch on Redbubble. We've got t-shirts, hoodies, mugs, and all kinds of great evangelical stuff that you can wear proudly. All proceeds go to building and promoting the podcast. We want to give a huge shout out to our Patreon supporters. Subscribers get a range of benefits, including free merch, early access to episodes, access to our exclusive subscribers group, and monthly bonus content. Again, all proceeds of this go to the running and promotion cost of the podcast. A special thanks to Ava, who manages our social strategy, and also to Kerry and Bree, who manage our Facebook listener group, and also to Bree, who puts out our monthly newsletter on Substack. All of our episodes are transcribed by Leanne to increase accessibility. The show is produced and hosted by Brian McDowell and Troy Waller. The sound engineering for this episode was done by Beck Wise. I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist is available wherever you find your podcasts. Again, you can find all our links in our link tree in the show notes. Or why don't you pop across to our website at www.iwasateenagefundamentalist.com.